Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Charleston 2022 Charleston In Between. We're so happy that you're here joining us today. Give me just a moment to share my screen to get some welcome slides going for us. The session is being recorded and videos will be sent to all registered attendees by the beginning of next week. So be on the lookout for that to come through your inbox. And we do ask that you complete a brief attendee evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is really important to us to help us improve, to know what we're doing well and how we can get better. I'd like to say a word of thank you to our sponsors for this event. We could not do this without help from our partners in the industry. Especially would like to thank Cambridge University Press and Clarivate for providing refreshments for attendees, lunches and coffee break respectively. So thank you to them. And also, while I'm doing thank yous, I would be remiss if I did not say thank you to Katina Strauch, who is our conference founder and convener, whose entrepreneurial and innovative spirit is the one who started everything. She founded the conference back in 1980 and is still going strong with lots and lots of ideas coming out every year, including Charleston In Between. So thank you to Katina. I'd also like to thank Don Lewis, who is in the background. He is our AV manager who handles all the videography and tech needs for these events. I'd like to thank Caroline Goldsmith, who's our associate director. She handles the sponsorships and was the one who arranged the Grubhub gift cards and the Starbucks gift cards for the attendees. So thank you, Dawn and Caroline. And with that, we're going to get into our first session today. Again, is the mergers and acquisitions discussion chaired by Roger Schonfeld. So Roger, thank you very much for putting this together. And I'm going to hand things over to you to get started.
Thanks so much, Leah. It's such a pleasure. It's always such a pleasure to participate in all the different kinds of Charleston events, and certainly this second iteration of the Charleston In Between program. I am going to be bringing you two components of this. Our sort of session is divided into two components. The first is an interview format, basically keynote with two of the leaders of Clarivate, and we'll get started with that in a moment. And then following that, I'll be doing a more broader sort of strategic landscape review of the mergers and acquisitions space more broadly. So let me start by introducing and welcoming Chris Burghardt, who is the Senior Vice President and General Manager of Clarivate's work on coming out of much of which comes from the ProQuest side of the organization, but much of which also comes out of the Clarivate side of the organization. And Chris, I know you'll tell us a little bit more about exactly how that's scoped and defined. Chris is someone who I've had a chance to know for a number of years now and work together with, and is a great colleague of in a variety of different and important ways. And then secondly, but not last, is Ofer Mosseri, who is now the general manager of Libris, and so is looking after, as I understand it, all the different component parts of what once was an independent company, now a very important brand and set of services for our community. So thank you so much, both of you, for not just for joining us today, but joining us today together, which is it's really nice to see that configuration that you're able to be together. I know you mentioned you're in a new office, so you may like to tell us a little bit more about that. But to start, let me just express my congratulations to you and your colleagues on completing the acquisition. I know how much that means. I mean, I don't know exactly how much that means, but it's an enormous undertaking to bring two big companies together, not just in terms of the financing of it, which is sometimes what the news reports are all about, but merging together cultures and sales teams and offices and reporting relationships and business processes and many other things like that. And I'm sure this work is not yet completed. I'm sure this is a process that will continue for some time. You both come most recently from the ProQuest and Libris side of the organization, and I think that might surprise some people actually to find that the company being acquired is the one that ends up in some of the leadership roles. And we probably don't have to get into too much of the details of that if you don't want to, but I think that's a very important recognition that there really are two companies coming together and not just one taking over the other. So to start, maybe could you just tell us a little bit about the acquisition and where you are in that integration process?
Yeah, sure, Roger. Just can you hear me okay? Just quick thumbs up, make sure we're good. Okay, good. Thanks so much. First of all, thank you for inviting Ofer and me to participate today. We're really thrilled to be here. We're thrilled to be here together from our new London office, which just opened up last week. And for any customers and partners, we're really looking forward to hosting you and showing you our new office. So we're happy to be together and glad we could do this today. Let me just start by saying, Roger, the acquisition is still very new. And it's important to remember that while the press and the PR is a year old on the acquisition, the companies operate as two independent and separate entities up until 5 months ago. So we've been really focusing on what we've really learned over those last 5 months is just how ProQuest and Clarivate have a shared vision for research and teaching and learning in the library and university space, and a shared respect for customers and colleagues, and a lot of shared and deep knowledge and talent, which we're really thrilled to bring together. In the last 5 months, we've been focusing on carefully organizing our business to be more outside in focused, and so we've created an academic and government group, which really we call an industry vertical, is what you might hear referred to, and is focused on the university market, the library market, and government institutions. So the first thing we've really worked on is how can we work together and look to do to bring our products, bring them together in a more interactive way for our customers. So seemingly small things that will make a big impact, like bringing EndNote into Web of Science for interactivity, RefWorks into the PQIS platform, Web of Science data into some of the Ex Libris areas as well. So I'll start there. Maybe Ofer, you might like to pick up a little bit more about your experience so far.
Sure. So hi, Roger, and thanks for having us today. So yeah, I think it's very exciting, very busy time for us, very fast-paced, and we are all very excited by the acquisition and the integration. And I think that really even looking at the people, some of the people holding the most senior positions now running the academia and the government vertical, as Chris mentioned, are indeed coming from the ex-ProQuest or ex Libris divisions or business units, and I think it's great. It's not just continuity, but also close knowledge of the solutions and the integrations and the customers. And I think that we are now starting really to pursue those very promising integration synergies between the solutions. We are looking at optimizing collection management with things like Alma as a library management system, and Insights, the business insights. We have products like Web of Science and eBook Central that could also fit together. And of course, a very natural fit between products like Converis, Esploro, the funding solutions we have, Pivot and Research Professional. We are only now starting to scratch the surface with all those many promising opportunities.
Great. Well, thank you. It's interesting to hear you jumping in to talk about integration. So we can talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But it is interesting to hear about the academic and government group. And do you want to maybe just say just a tiny bit more about what that means, what that will look like, or is that it might be helpful to just get a sense of that since you mentioned it.
Yeah, sure. So, we're really just getting started in putting a stake in the ground. First and foremost, focusing on universities and libraries and government organizations or institutions. The way we're organized around academic government is having leaders for some of our key product areas. So for myself, I'm focused on as you mentioned, the ProQuest heritage side information solutions, as well as the Web of Science portfolio. You may recall, Roger, I formerly ran Web of Science years ago, and so now it's really wonderful to come back and really see what progress has been made and have an opportunity to really impact the future for that as well. And then, of course, Ofer, leading up the Ex Libris division. But we're seeing that also across our sales and marketing. And as Ofer mentioned earlier, we're really seeing a really nice blend of leaders from ProQuest and also from Clarivate taking leadership positions. So you'll hear a lot more about that as we start to announce publicly the structure. But it's what I can say is that the team is laser focused and has been what I've been really pleased about is just seeing the way the Clarivate legacy heritage teams and the ProQuest heritage teams are starting to work together and really starting to think about ways we can do much more for our customers in terms of not only product integrations but thinking about where we might go in the future with new values. So just an exciting time I think for all of us.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's maybe turn a little bit to talk about corporate strategy for a few minutes. So, and the competitive landscape, which is a little bit of what I'll be trying to interpret in the subsequent sessions. So, in terms of the academic and government market that you were just talking about, many observers will probably see this new Clarivate, if I can call it that, increasingly positioned against Elsevier as a principal contributor. I might say number one, but let's not go in that kind of thing. But in terms of things like research analytics, research management solutions, et cetera, which are some of the directions that both of your organizations have been taking in recent years. But of course, Elsevier is an enormous primary publisher also. And Clarivate, by turn, has particular strength in this market in things like aggregation and curation, distribution of others' content, right? So on the content side, they're actually, Elsevier and Clarivate are actually very different from one another. And on the Clarivate side, things like books and primary sources and so forth. So can you tell us a little bit about the competitive landscape in this academic and government market? I mean, sort of looking outside of Clarivate, beyond Clarivate, what does that look like to you? And what are some of Clarivate's distinctive elements of its corporate strategy here?
Yeah. Thanks, Roger. Yeah. It certainly is a competitive space, no doubt. I mean, we think about this, and we'll call it the new Clarivate very soon. But we think about Clarivate and ProQuest bringing together these complementary strengths, and I think that's been one of the things that we've seen is just how 1 + 1 is going to equal much more than 2, especially over time. It's allowing us to create much more comprehensive resources, and then especially with our real focus on libraries and really libraries as customers and partners, enable libraries to play even more impactful role in their institutions. And so what I mean by that is for ProQuest, enormous content collections and aggregations, well over 1.5 billion in terms of item counts. And it's not just scholarly journals and books, but also the broad range of social sciences and arts humanities content delivered through also primary sources, government records, historical records, current and historical news, video. So we just think there's a real opportunity to take the breadth of this content and really extend the entire view on additional aspects of scholarly research and academia. And then, of course, Clarivate is the obviously trusted and really premier citation index, and data and analytics is really the strength of that company coming together as well. And Ofer, maybe you want to talk a bit about libraries and workflows. I think that's a really important element, that kind of the third leg of the stool, if you will, that we see is our real strength of the company.
Sure. So from the Elsevier side, of course, for us coming from the library world, with strong focus on libraries, academic research, national libraries, we still very much remain focused on this market. And I believe that we are also bringing this expertise and focus and priorities into the larger Clarivate, something that is very much complementary to the traditional or legacy Clarivate business. So while we are indeed expanding to the research office, to new stakeholders in the institution, we still very much remain focused on the library workflows. We believe we have a lot to benefit from this integration into Clarivate, including areas that we were only starting again to scratch the surface, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, all those cutting-edge technologies that are very advanced. Mature, I would even say, in Clarivate, could help us better serve our customers, the library people, while we are also supporting teaching, learning, research, and other activities. So for us, corporate strategy, or at least the Elsevier corporate strategy, is very much still the same, empowering libraries to take even a bigger role in the institution. And of course, there are those technological overarching themes like analytics, like AI that I mentioned, and also themes that are very important for us today, probably more than ever before, like diversity, equity, inclusion. What does it mean to our systems, to the content we manage in our platforms? All those things are also taking a very high priority.
So that's, it's very interesting to hear the continued emphasis on the library part of this sector. And I'm sure to the Charleston audience, that will be very reassuring for a lot of people. One of the things that has been interesting to track across the sector is this effort by a number of companies to look beyond the library in terms of, the opportunity to provide some of the research management solutions, research analytics, other kinds of workflow tools, et cetera, and, ultimately tapping beyond the library as a customer within the academic setting, but also looking towards, the research office or the provost's office. I mean, we've seen some acquisition activity that takes other companies in that direction as well recently. So, it's clear that you have a portfolio that stretches, is not just about perhaps within Ex Libris is just about the library, but certainly looking across Web of Science and Converis and Esploro and some of the other tools, like there is an audience beyond the library for those tools and services. So, it would be helpful to hear a little bit more about, how does, I'm sure you are making efforts to engage the research office and the senior research officer and so forth. And how does that fit with the library? And to Ofer, to your point, kind of empowering the library, I think that's a really powerful statement to make there.
Yeah, so again, I think that we see the library as the main stakeholder, the main customer that we serve, and we throughout the years, over 20 years of Ex Libris history, we always evolved with the changing role of academic and research libraries. If it was just in the past managing resources, print to electronic to digital, resource sharing, networks of libraries, indeed now it's the changing role beyond the core workflows of providing access to data, but also supporting teaching and learning and research. And this area of the library at the heart also of research excellence is something that we take very seriously. We have we have solutions in the area. First and foremost, discovery platforms, whether it's Primo or Summon, that are very important, of course, for research. But in the last few years, we expanded with institutional repository, research data management solutions, funding solutions. Those are all things that we have pursuing in the last few years. And again, we don't see a contradiction. We see this as a natural fit or expansion to the role of the library itself. And we believe that this is what we're trying to do, to empower the academic libraries to take even a bigger role or a higher seat around the table.
Sorry, do you see signs that is working? I mean, I think it'd be really interesting to hear how that is going. Yeah, like the library's taking a bigger role. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Without getting too detailed information, we do see more and more customers when they look at a complete digital transformation of the library, taking this leap into managing electronic resources, digital assets management. At the same time, they're also looking at how they support teaching and learning, how they support research, how they bring their expertise around managing data into other departments in the organization, how they provide a mobile experience to new patrons, especially the younger generation. And we see this not just as a changing discussion with customers, but also de facto the type of contracts we sign with customers. More and more contracts that include the core research library management system, in our case Alma, but those complementing solutions procured at the same time as part of a bigger digital transformation strategy.
Thanks. That's really interesting, and I'm sure will be exciting for the libraries involved at least, and probably many others as well. So I'd like to now turn a little bit to some of the logic behind an acquisition like the one that Clarivate made of ProQuest. There's a variety of different ways to justify acquisitions, and I'm not going to try to tell you what the right way to justify any particular one here may be, but often they're justified through a combination of reducing costs, right? There's usually a logic around reducing costs, and also a logic of adding value on the product side, right? There's usually some combination of those two things. And I'd like to start by talking about the cost reductions, which is probably an area that the library community doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about in those terms, right? At the earnings call, so there was an earnings call earlier this week for Clarivate, where it reported its first quarter and of 2022 and answered questions from some of the Wall Street analysts. And at that call, there was some discussion about cost reductions, and I believe the number that I got was that there was an anticipated cost reduction as a result of this merger of something on the order of $100 million, and I think reporting that you're somewhere like a third of the way towards that goal already, if I understood correctly. And so, recognizing that you're not all the way there, but you've clearly started to realize some of those cost reductions. Can you tell us a little bit, like on the academic and government side and in the product categories that you've both been talking about, where are those cost reductions being found? And there have been some departures on, executive departures on, probably naturally enough on sales and customer service and product leadership roles, that probably just the natural turnover that happens at this moment. But can you tell us a little bit more broadly about like where are you finding cost reductions, and how, if at all, will that affect either end users or the libraries that you've mentioned are your primary customer?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Roger. Well, first of all, when two successful companies come together, the combination, the thesis is predominantly around about growth, about growing, success of the company, expansion, and really the future. But as can be expected with a transaction of this size, there are overlap functions between the companies. For example, technology and infrastructure. So just maybe an example to see where this is starting to come from already is with our Office 365 migration. So we've moved all of the ProQuest employees just in 4 months, which is just that alone is a remarkable feat. But it's not just about the cost savings; it's actually helping our colleagues across both companies now integrate, communicate and collaborate in the same platform. And you're going to see us, doing that with other types of, internal type of systems as well, where it makes sense to do that. Of course, it's not just about, there's overlap locations, overlap programs, and there are some overlap roles. And one of the things I will say is that, one of the things Ofer and I have been really working closely on is, it's about talent identification and looking for those opportunities. We have, several areas where we've been able to actually redeploy some really excellent talent across our portfolio. We're really I think we're in a really great shape to really take those challenges on. Our integration team is mostly involved in operational improvements and efficiencies, and of course cost savings are part of that. But I do want to say, you mentioned investment, and this was on the earnings call as well, that there is still, for this year, we're focused on, investing in our products. And so the expectation is we would spend $185 million on capital expenditures, and about 75% of that is on R&D projects for products, both enhancements and new product development as well. And so I think a decent portion of that obviously is going to the academic government space as well. We won't obviously talk specifics about specific investments there as well. And I think I also point to Clarivate's success in acquisitions, whether it's bringing in larger organizations like CPA Global, of course there's Publons, Gubernio, DRG. So I think there's a real track record of bringing these organizations in successfully and really being able to grow and build on those businesses.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and it's interesting to hear the scale of the capital investment that the company's planning to continue to make. So the other side of this, of course, is the opportunity to add value on the product side, and you kind of ran through some of those examples right at the beginning. So I'd like to take a few minutes to dig in a little bit more deeply into some of those. Obviously, one of the most, and this is probably a question for Ofer, like one of the most core assets of the, certainly of the ProQuest X Libris side of the organization has been Alma, and I think continues to be Alma, the library management or library systems platform, as I'm told I must call it. So at the same time, it does seem in the US that there is a bit of an uptick. I mean, Alma has had a commanding position within the research library market, but recently more research libraries appear to be giving Folio, the open source service, some real consideration. There have been a number of migrations that are at various stages of completion. Some are just roadmaps to be sure. But I think it has led to a question that certainly that some librarians have about how is Alma fully recognizing that there are investments on these sort of adjacent properties like Esploro and so forth that are important, but how is Alma itself as a library systems platform evolving? How will it evolve? Like what can we expect to see? What kinds of investments can we expect to see in the coming 3 or 5 years there?
Thank you for the question, Roger. So, of course, we are well aware of the competition. We always had competition, of course, and we don't dismiss any competitor. And choice is important. And we know that we are, operating in a large industry, and there is room for everyone across everything we do. I believe that with Alma, not just very comprehensive system, but also a very mature one. Still, there is so much more we can do for the customers, and Alma is a single specific product remains our biggest area of investment when we look at the development effort. And I think that we still have very active, very exciting roadmap for Alma across the board. So starting with user experience or the user interface and simplification, streamlining of workflows. We work very closely with the thousands of customers that are using Alma around the world, and we are monitoring their feedback, their enhancements very closely. That we have very active, very I would even say unique collaboration model with the user communities like Iluna in North America or Igloo in the rest of the world, and we know that this is an area that needs to get a lot of attention. And indeed, later this year and into next year, Alma will see a major redesign, simplification, streamlining of many workflows, eliminating some steps across many of the core workflows, whether it's acquisition and search and patron services and more. Beyond that, of course, another area of investment is analytics. And again, here I do want to refer to Clarivate as a very good home for us to experiment and to boost our development. We very quickly discovered a very smart, sizable team of data scientists at Clarivate that are helping us, already working now with the Alma, with the Primo, and the other product teams, and we believe that we will be able to launch more AI, smart solutions for Alma as well. Of course, we have those new needs and trends, whether it's CDL, controlled digital lending, new capabilities around linked data that are so important for customers and libraries moving forward. This is a very big area of investment for us. Alma and the adjacent or the complementing solutions like Rapido, Metador, we may want to talk about it later, but those solutions that go hand in hand with Alma. And we are doing all this, of course, while still keeping a very open technology and platform. those APIs. Sometimes we are blamed of having Alma sometimes as a closed system, but actually Alma through the open APIs has the largest API traffic, more than 2.5 billion APIs calls annually. And initiatives that we took last year with cloud apps, allowing customers to develop all those extensions running on the Alma built-in platform, not as an API, but as a built-in app, cloud app we call it, already used by many dozens of developers around the world. So I think that you will see more innovation, more strong, forward-looking capabilities from Alma, simplifying, streamlining some of the workflows, while introducing new capabilities into the system. Much more exciting stuff to come.
Thank you. That's actually very good to hear. Very helpful to hear. I do want to try to come back to Metador in a few minutes, but before we get there, I do have a couple of other things that I want to come to. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about what I see as the other sort of principal flagship product of the A&G group here, which is Web of Science, right? And Web of Science is sort of the I don't know what the right term here is the sort of oldest and most important citation platform of certainly the oldest, and in some ways the most significant in terms of the power of the journal impact factor in particular. And so I think some people have raised questions about, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, about the dominance of the journal impact factor. Is that appropriate or inappropriate? Does its dominance sort of hold up Web of Science more than it? There's all sorts of questions that people can ask. But I'm curious a little bit about where you see that kind of set of properties around citation management, discovery, et cetera, where that's going. Are there plans to kind of invest more on the analytics and impact side there, should we expect to see Web of Science as a place where publishers syndicate their content to, in the same way that some of the other major discovery platforms have turned into, as ResearchGate seems to be going in that direction, and Elsevier Science Direct as well. So Chris, I think you're the one who's going to take this one, but I guess I'm up because
Ofer's going to, he's had his turn, I guess, on that. But no, thanks, Roger, for Web of Science. Well, first of all, we are, Web of Science is one of the, like you said, it's really a core product for Clarivate, and we think core product for many universities and librarians. We're focusing on how we can bring more, as being a really true citation index from the start and building on that. We're looking at, our roadmap includes new content additions such as preprints, looking at a real complete way to bring that into the platform, and not only standardized metadata, but complete cited references. We're working on a more unified researcher author profile. So not only within the assets within Clarivate, but also thinking about what also could be available from funding profiles, for example, that we have in Pivot as well. The Pivot data, that's a really great enrichment to the funding acknowledgements that are already captured in Web of Science. So the awarded grant data and so forth. And then if you think about preprints extending Web of Science back to an earlier part of the publishing process, early stage, we're also looking at early career research, and that's where the ProQuest dissertations and theses product, which is a full text product predominantly with some A&I, where there's definitely some real opportunities there. We've already taken the first step. This is not an integration yet, but we've launched a citation insights on the ProQuest platform with ProQuest dissertation and theses. So that just launched in the last week, and we should be out in the market with some public information on that very soon. So we're really thrilled about what's to come. You're going to see a lot more from not only within Web of Science, but how that might then enrich think about the opportunity to bring citations into the ProQuest platform. That full text I spoke of earlier is also another source of maybe information. For example, if a news article is cited, it's a very easy leap over to our robust news article. And then thinking about how this might actually play into a lot of the ex libris area as well. In terms of syndication, there's no immediate plans for syndication. We're really focused on the linking out, the appropriate linking to and efficient linking out to resources, whether from Web of Science, but also obviously we do that across a number of our discovery products as well. So still a lot to come. You'll be hearing a lot more from us in this area. But the collection of assets we think are really going to be come together in a very valuable way to enrich Web of Science, build on that heritage, and really take it to the next level.
Thank you. So I want to turn to an area that I think has been a pretty hot area, but one where Clarivate and frankly Ex Libris also haven't been market leaders, at least up until this point, which is the area that we sometimes call research information management or CRIS, RIM. Like, it has a lot of different names, but it seems at least at some point to have become something of a duopoly between digital sciences symplectic service and Elsevier's Pure, and with other services kind of hanging. I don't want to say hanging on to them, but adjacent to them. Elsevier, as you know, just made what I'm sure is a 9-digit investment in purchasing Interfolio, the service for basically faculty career management, sort of how I think of what its services group into, and that will surely have a lot of power as it becomes integrated in a variety of ways with Pure and some of Elsevier's other properties. I won't ask you whether Clarivate bid on Interfolio, and I know you wouldn't answer if I did ask that. But can you tell me a little bit? I mean, we know that I believe it's been announced that Converis is moving into Ex Libris and presumably being integrated with Esploro in certain ways anyway, or there's some kind of alignment taking place there. Can you tell me a little bit about what the plans are for research information management within Clarivate? I mean, is it, as Esploro has been, really an effort to bring the libraries into research information management, as Ofer, you kind of described that as a core part of the corporate strategy earlier? And if so, is that a limitation on being able to compete in some of the places where it's really less about the library and more about the Office of Research? So I don't know, I'd just be curious, like, what your plans overall are for RIM and how you're thinking about that space broadly. Sure.
Yeah. So I think that the recent move by Elsevier, without getting into details, I think it's still early days for everyone, probably also for them. But we will need to see how it develops. But I think it only shows how big, how fragmented is the market, and how much more opportunity there is to innovate, to integrate, to provide added value between different siloed systems. We believe that we are taking the same journey. So, Roger, we mentioned Converis, Esploro. We did quite quickly brought the two products under one roof, as part of the Ex Libris responsibility. Not because those are two identical solutions, but we believe there is a lot of complementing assets over there, and those are not exactly the same solutions. Converis, very highly customized, very, very flexible solution. Also, very important for customers that wish to have an on-premise deployment of the system, while Esploro, with the cloud deployment, advanced analytics, smart harvesting, tight integration to the library and to the discovery layer, is bringing something different. And there's, again, so many opportunities for us to bring those capabilities together, to tie it more tightly to Alma on one side, to discovery, to Web of Science, to the funding opportunities. We believe we have many, many assets in this space. Some of them are even unique to us. And again, I think that with Converis, we find ourselves in a similar situation to similar cases we had in the past. It's not the first time that we find ourselves with very similar or kind of a brother and sister products. We had it with Primo and Summon. We had it earlier days with some of the legacy library systems. And we take it very, very seriously, very, very sensitively. We know that there are customers behind those products and needs and history. And at the moment, we are just trying to learn to make sure that we bring the best of both worlds for the benefit of the customers. And again, we believe that with everything we have across our portfolio, Clarivate, ProQuest, Libris, we have so much to offer to customers.
Okay, well, one final question. I know we don't have very much more time, but several competitors over the years have been really intrigued by the opportunity to disrupt OCLC's market dominance on shared cataloging and interlibrary sharing. And I just think that's a reality of the market. And this is not just ProQuest or Libris by any means. You've made a really strong play over the last several years in the ILL market. And so is Metador an effort to leverage Alma to build a shared bibliographic utility that will compete with OCLC?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. It's very timely, of course, because we are now starting to expose some of our activities with Metador to the customers, and we see really a staggering level of interest by customers in this initiative. I think it's a continuation of something that we are doing all the time. And this is really trying to automate, to optimize the core workflows, the core responsibilities of libraries, and trying to free more of their time, resources, energy, budgets to advanced patron-facing services. And managing metadata, of course, is something that is here to stay. It's core. It's fundamental to what libraries are doing. But it could be done in a better way. And we see this goes hand in hand with our activities with the resource sharing solutions, RapidILL, Rapido, that, by the way, expand dramatically over the last 1 year. And Metador is coming to add another element to those automation, optimization of core workflows. And again, we believe that Metador is a smart way or a new solution to an old problem by harnessing the power of the community. We do have a very, very large community of customers, many, many thousands. So subject to the consent of those members, we could bring those records to the benefit of the wider community. We want to make it smarter with analytics. Part of the key elements of Metador are those preferred record service, something that is based on a smart algorithm, on institutional preferences, all kinds of smart ways of handling those workflows, of course, done in a very open way. Roger, I think you hinted to Alma as the anchor, but we do see Metador as something relevant for everyone. All libraries, it's a free of charge service for the bibliographical record for Alma and non-Alma customers alike. And again, we believe that we can do it in a smart way for the benefit of the community.
Well, Chris and Ofer, thank you so much. I was able to work in some questions that came in over the chat during the course of the conversation. So I hope that was clear that we were doing something a little bit dynamic along the way. There has been some speculation in the chat about who the portrait behind you may be. So would you, if you'd like to tell us that.
We prepared.
Want to say?
Yeah, sure. Why not? So I think we need to
it up a little bit. Yeah, it's not Chris. Someone thought it was Chris. It's definitely not me. So,
so this is Gregorio Zara. So we are in the Clarivate office, and all the meeting rooms have portraits of inventors and leading scientists. Gregorio Zara, a Filipino origin engineer, the one who invented the first two-way video conference device.
So,
very, very applicable to our discussion today.
so we're doing this today because of
him.
Gregory. So
Interesting.
that's the tie-in.
Wonderful. Okay, well, listen, thank you both so very much. Really appreciate the chance to hear from you, and good luck with next steps. Looking forward to catching up again soon.
Great, thanks,
Thank you,
Roger.
Roger.
Have a great rest of the conference, everyone, and
Okay.
we'll see you soon. Bye now. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye. So so the next it was great to have a chance to hear from Clarivate, from two really interesting leaders who are basically responsible for plotting the next set of directions for the academic and government side, at least, of Clarivate. But of course, Clarivate's only one part of the landscape that we're trying to track and understand. And so now I'm going to do a little bit of a run through of some of what we've seen more broadly in the landscape of scholarly publishing. And I'm hoping that this landscape review will be helpful to our community in showing some of the directions that are actually differentiated that the scholarly publishers are pursuing. For those of you who don't know me, I work at Ithaka S&R, and you'll see a number of colleagues and collaborators who are credited along the way here. This is really an effort to sort of synthesize some of what we're taking away about where the publishing community is moving towards right now. And after this presentation, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. Please feel free to get into the discussion. I'm really happy to hear from as wide a variety of voices as part of this section of the program as possible. So I want to just take 1 second to establish a little bit of framing in terms of the scope and bounds of what I mean anyway when I talk about scholarly publishing here today. I'm definitely talking not just about commercial organizations, but about all different kinds of business models, not-for-profit organizations, the full open source solutions, et cetera. And also not just primary publishing, as we just heard from the colleagues from Clarivate. I'm anyway, equally interested in considering the platforms and workflow and analytics and infrastructure directions that many of the players in this sector are pursuing. And then just to say a word about mergers and acquisitions, because this is a term that's thrown around somewhat freely sometimes, but it's fairly unusual to see an actual merger within the commercial marketplace. It's much more typical to see acquisitions where one company buys another. There's also possible to see other kinds of strategic partnerships. And I just want to take a second to say that it should never, ever surprise us to see one company buying another company. That's any company that is a commercial organization, if it's not publicly held, it is, particularly if it's not publicly held, there is someone who would ultimately like to be able to sell it at some point in the future. So that's just a thing to bear in mind about the commercial sector. Whereas not-for-profits are more likely, rather than to acquire one another, it's more likely that they'll merge together, although they can make acquisitions of their own. So this is the sort of landscape that I just want to walk us through for a few minutes. So looking backwards, if you look back maybe 2 decades or so, publishers were just beginning their digital transformation, right? They often were beginning to publish online. Maybe they'd been publishing online for a few years. It was often pretty rudimentary if you look back at some of the standards and protocols and systems that were being used back then from our perspective. Open access had really not yet taken hold in any meaningful way. And 20 years ago, as a result, and before then also, the vast majority of the acquisitions in the scholarly publishing sector were driven by one strategy. It was to grow the primary publishing list, grow the scope of journals or books or what have you that were being published, either to seek scale, outright scale, so you could sell more things more easily, expand the disciplinary coverage or perhaps the geographic coverage, other kinds of portfolio coverage goals. And this strategy still exists, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but it has gone from something like 100% of the driver of mergers and acquisitions to something that's probably, I don't know, 5% of the driver. And that shift is a very, very important one strategically that that I'm going to encourage that we dig into together. Now, the context and strategy that that exist in our environment today, not just for publishers, but as publishers see the sector, is driven by a few factors, and here are a few of those key factors. So one is that library budgets haven't kept pace with the growth of higher education institutions, and particularly that of the research enterprise. Nobody knows this better than librarians themselves, yourselves, ourselves, who are often faced with having to do more with less, or not, having to support more without commensurate increases in resources. That, in some ways is a compliment to the libraries for being terrifically efficient in one way of thinking, but also a deep challenge, as I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone here on the session today. Another key factor, of course, is open access. Open access has taken hold widely over the past decade or so, and it's changing the nature of the scholarly publishing businesses. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And finally, globalization, by which companies have expanded the customer base for their scholarly publications dramatically, from being principally located in one or a small number of countries to having a footprint that is, if not fully global, is clearly international. That strategy, while it has been very good for the bottom line of many publishers, that strategy at a certain point will be completed and will not have any more room for growth. So that's another factor in thinking about how particularly commercial publishers see the world around them. This has informed several important strategic directions. First of all, as I think a lot of people know, publishers have monetized open access initially by developing the market for APCs and sourcing those APCs, not entirely by any means, but to a large extent from research grants. So in other words, instead of just, if you like, seeking funding through the library budget, publishers began to realize that they could seek revenue from research grants, from research funding, from the research office in some cases. And that interesting and eye-opening realization among the publishers. Secondly, they've then stabilized their publishing revenues in the face of certain kinds of risks through transformative agreements. So particularly in some markets outside of the US and North America, so not principally in the US and North America, but especially in Europe and some other countries, transformative agreements have been the main way that publishers now sell their services, which may not be clear to everyone coming from more of a North American perspective. Well, anyway, those strategic directions in their publishing businesses aside, publishers are now seeing opportunities to add meaningful value through a turn to services. And I've been talking about this in a variety of ways for a number of years. I'm going to dig into this in a little bit more specificity today by talking about this turn to services. And services is a broad category. It includes various kinds of platforms that we just heard some of them from Clarivate a minute ago, various kinds of workflow tools or analytics tools or different kinds of infrastructure. And I'm going to get into some of the specifics in a moment, but the development of services is now driving a great deal of corporate strategy and organizational restructuring. And this is a point that that Lisa Janicki-Hinchliffe and myself that we made in a presentation that we gave earlier this month, trying to really reflect on what the trend here is. The trend is that services development is the thing that's driving the vast majority of acquisitions. And I want to say that in contrast to the idea that expanding the list of the publisher, the publishing list, which used to drive the vast majority of acquisitions. And I think that realization, that sort of perspective that Lisa and I have tried to begin to kind of work through and bring bear is one that I really want to suggest is something that we should see as a fundamental element of this landscape for acquisitions today. Now, that said, I do want to paint a broader picture around strategic directions. And the thing that I want to paint most particularly is that there is no single strategic direction. There are a set of interlinked ones. And I'm going to try to walk through what I see some of those as being. Some of those strategic directions are more on the publishing side. And I want to talk about those. But some of them really take scholarly publishers beyond primary publishing. And I'm going to walk through each of those two things in turn here. So if we focus on publishing for a minute, first I'm going to refer you to the third bullet, which is growing the primary publishing list. I made that point earlier. 20 years ago, that's what we were doing, or rather that's what publishers were doing. And indeed, that is still an agenda item, a strategic agenda item for some set of particularly smaller, not the probably top 5 or 7 publishers in terms of size or revenue volume, but for others, that still may be important to round out a list, expand coverage, et cetera. But the first and second bullets here are the ones that are newer. Providing publishing services at scale for smaller organizations, and in particular for scholarly societies, is one strategic direction that is driving at least one major scholarly publisher right now. Bolstering the version of record, the idea that the final published article, the version of record as it's often called, can be bolstered and strengthened by integrating additional kinds of content types, linking them with it. For example, preprints or research data. I'll say a little bit more about each of these, but that is a brand new direction in the last 5 years. And it's proving to be a very important one as a result of some of the directions that the publisher, that the competitive landscape is opening up within publishers. So these 3 strategic directions, they can be complementary to one another. Probably no publisher is pursuing all of them, but those are really more about what you might think of as more traditional or historic or expected primary publishing. But there's also another set of strategic directions that go well beyond what we would think of traditionally as publishing. These include delivering scholarly workflow tools and services in ways that support discovery and access, and also research collaboration. And this workflow issue is a really important one. Another one is scaling up open source. So there are some providers in our space that really see scaling up open source and community-based solutions that take us beyond publishing as a key strategic direction. A third area is management tools for the research enterprise. All of those systems that we were, that things like the research information management, research analytics, efforts to address research competitiveness at the university level, et cetera, these have proved to be in some contexts very important and valued management tools. And then as well, sustaining shared infrastructure, in some cases for community benefit, in other cases that might get leveraged for proprietary benefit. And I want to make sure to tease that out a little bit because it really does matter for our community. So I'm going to now dig into each of those areas with a little bit more detail. On the publishing side, what does this look like in terms of acquisitions and services integration? So on the publishing service, the idea that publishers are providing services at scale for smaller organizations or other organizations. A number of the companies in this sector have made substantial acquisitions that fall into this area over the course of recent years. Wiley has probably done half a dozen different acquisitions that in one way or another are about building a portfolio that help it serve scholarly societies in a way that is not just publishing for them, but providing the more granular services that societies might be looking for. So that is one enormous direction, and perhaps even the principal strategic direction that Wiley's research division has been pursuing. But Clarivate itself has, several years ago acquired a service called Publons that plays a role in peer review management and related services, and of course operates, as many will know, the Scholar One sort of manuscript submission and management system. And Elsevier acquired the Aries system, which competes with Scholar One just a few years ago as well. And so through these services, Clarivate sells to many of the major scholarly publishers, and Elsevier sells to many of the major scholarly publishers, which is a really, and Wiley does as well through Adipon. So this is actually a really interesting new direction in which the publishing services, if what some might have called the infrastructure for scholarly publishing, has started to get acquired by some of the major publishers themselves. And usually with the initial promise that there will be an absolute iron wall between these publishing services and their core primary publishing divisions, with the idea that conflicts of interest will be managed and addressed. But how that plays itself out over time is always something that many people are looking at and thinking about. In this respect, two of the services that certainly merit being watched include Highwire and Silverchair, which are publishing platforms that many of the particularly society publishers rely on, and both of which are currently organized independently. But that may be a part of the sector that's worth watching, looking ahead. So so another area, as I've mentioned, is the idea of bolstering the version of record. This is a real concern for publishers that historically have been the organizing force behind the scholarly record, in the sense that particularly in science, the journal article itself is the sort of has been the sort of organizing spine of the scholarly record. Who wrote which article? What impact does it have? That is all about how credit gets assigned and success in many ways gets measured. But there have been a number of really interesting threats to the journal article, the version of record, as that organizing force. So think about preprints, which for some time, and certainly particularly during the pandemic, have really played themselves out as an important, in some cases, alternative, not just predecessor to, but alternative to the published article. And we're also seeing interest more broadly in other kinds of ways of thinking about the scholarly article. So as one example, we're seeing publishers that are deeply interested in, or not just publishers, all sorts of players that are deeply interested in turning the article, the, let's say, 30-page long PDF text, largely text-based article, into something that over time will be read, perhaps not principally by humans, but more and more by machines. And in order to enable that machine readability and machine usability and the kind of analytics and insights that many believe can take place as a result, ultimately that 30-page, let's say, PDF it needs to be or can be decomposed into a set of machine readable protocols, a set of machine readable methods, a set of machine readable data, et cetera, and other different components. And so we're starting to see questions about, what does that article actually become if you project out to an environment where humans aren't the principal, people aren't the principal consumers. And rather than consumers, I should probably say readers. And in that environment, what we may expect to see is, perhaps that article is no longer a 30-page human readable article. Perhaps it's a one-page long summary with all of those other elements becoming turned into more primarily machine readable formats. So all of this to say that set of questions is driving publishers to try to figure out, can they maintain control of the scholarly record? And with all the power and benefit that comes from having someone do that, and of course, all the power and benefit that comes to them from doing it themselves. And so there are a number of efforts taking place, you might say, to try to bolster the version of record. You might say to try to co-opt some of the competitors to the version of record. So Elsevier famously acquired Digital Commons, acquired bPress, the Digital Commons repository platform that that bPress operates, acquired SSRN, the pretty important preprint service, and acquired Aries, which as a manuscript submission and management system is in a lot of ways the glue that ties preprints together and other kinds of research artifacts together with the version of record through this submission and editorial management process. And so that's a really interesting, so far, as far as we can see, there's been relatively little integration across those three, but certainly there is an opportunity to think in a more integrated way there. Springer Nature similarly acquired Research Square. There have been some other acquisitions in this space as well. The services here that we might want to watch are other kinds of content type platforms, whether it be platforms for research data. Elsevier has turned its Mendeley acquisition into a platform that has a pretty substantial research data management component to it, but not just research data platforms, things on protocols and methods and other kinds of content types that may fit together with those versions of record are some other areas that may be worth watching in terms of that particular strategic direction. Now, I do want to acknowledge, I've said this already, I do want to acknowledge that this idea of continuing to grow a primary publishing list, although the largest publishing houses have largely ceased this activity, just a few weeks ago, Brill announced its acquisition of, I'm not going to try to pronounce this publishing house, I apologize, I don't know how to pronounce it, but a small but important publishing house that Brill has acquired. And I think that, I think we will see other cases like that. They will be more focused, they will be smaller scale. I'm not expecting to see Elsevier acquire Wiley or Taylor and Francis acquire Springer Nature or whatever it may be. I think at that level, we're probably not going to see any further acquisitions, but there may be some additional mid-sized publishers that some of those large houses might find themselves in the market for over the course of time. But I think in a lot of ways, if anything, more of the excitement, if I can call it that, or the perceived opportunity space anyway, is seen as being beyond publishing. And there are a number of different strategies here. Some of these are not being pursued by the folks in the scholarly publishing environment. There's quite a bit actually of spillover into other sectors here. And that's, I think, some of what makes this beyond publishing area quite dynamic and tricky to try to organize and understand. So I'm going to try to do that by talking through a number of different components of it. One which I've covered myself in some detail over the course of time is scholarly workflow tools. And these are tools that they may be about discovery and access. They may be index discovery services, things like that. They may take us in other directions, newer directions than even those kinds of services. But in some cases, they really drive for researchers at research collaboration. They enable new forms of connections and collaboration. So we certainly have things like Elsevier's acquisition of Mendeley a number of years ago. It seems like that didn't go in quite the direction they were expecting it to take, but that was an example of an acquisition that was consistent with this strategy. Sage, a few years ago, acquired a service called Lean Library, which is an interesting, smaller service in this space that has been interesting to follow and work with. And then another area that colleagues and I have been following pretty closely is efforts by some of the major scholarly publishers to partner with services like ResearchGate, services like Elsevier's Science Direct, to syndicate their content, make their content fully available under traditional licenses in some of those environments. So, so I think we're going to see a lot more happen in the scholarly workflow tool arena over the next few years. I want to take a minute to talk about scaling up open source, because in a variety of ways, there are important parts of our community that see open source as an alternative to some of the strategies that we've looked at previously. And indeed, there are some specific open source competitors in some of the categories that I've just walked through. I've been focusing on mergers and particularly acquisitions. So I haven't called out every single participant in those sectors, but with those strategies. But open source has been an important through open source there have been important efforts to try to compete. But what I do want to focus on specifically here is that within the realm of open source, there are efforts to scale up open source and build solutions that have the heft to try to offer certain forms of competition. And so, for example, DuraSpace, the provider of, among other tools, DSpace, DuraSpace was merged into Libris several years ago, and about 3 years ago now. And as a part of the fallout in a lot of ways from Elsevier building up that portfolio around defending its version of record. And so it's quite interesting to see the follow-on effects whereby Elsevier pursues one kind of strategy, which may not be an effort to close off access, something it may be, I'm not arguing with that, but it may not be an effort to close off access to solutions that have been used as infrastructure by the library and research communications communities. And then the follow-on effect is that DuraSpace needs to seek scale and frankly capital in order to sustain its open source communities. And so there's a merger that takes place there. I might also add and emphasize here that Folio has been a very interesting effort by our within the community to scale up, to build and scale up an open source solution, one that hasn't yet had an acquisition, at least as I understand it, or a merger. But in a lot of ways, when Olay was wound down, there was a sort of merger process that did result in some of the governance organizations that yielded Folio. So there's a number of cases in this space that are worth recognizing and thinking about as part of this consolidation, mergers and acquisitions environment. And I also want to make sure to emphasize something that I think is very important, both for Elsevier and Clarivate in particular, and digital science as well, which is supporting the research enterprise. This is typically less about, not exclusively, but typically has played itself out less as being about supporting libraries and more about supporting perhaps researchers directly, or more specifically, offices of research, the senior research officer, some of the folks who are involved in research funding, the research funding organizations. There have been a number of important acquisitions in this space. Elsevier acquired Pure a number of years ago now. Just the other day, a few weeks ago, announced that it was acquiring Interfolio. It also has SciVal as part of that portfolio. This set of research enterprise-focused tools over time becomes richly integrated on the back end. There is risk of lock-in both between these tools and across them with some of the other services that are being provided. There's a natural fit between these research enterprise tools and the citation index tools. So it's not a coincidence that Elsevier, Clarivate, and digital science, all three of them have major offerings in this area. Digital sciences is called Symplectic. And all three of them have fairly substantial citation indices, digital science with Dimensions, Clarivate, of course, with Web of Science, and Elsevier with Scopus. And so there's some really interesting connections there. I think that Interfolio, the acquisition of Interfolio, shows us convincingly that this area is a growth area for those who have the capital to make substantial continuing investments. We learned from the call earlier today that Clarivate sees some of its research information management as being a little bit more library adjacent than, as I understand it, Elsevier does. And I think that's a very interesting distinction, even within this supporting the research and enterprise strategic direction, is an interesting differentiation in terms of how it will play itself out, and frankly, what kinds of investments or acquisitions may get made in the future. So watch this space. And then last but not least, I do want to emphasize infrastructure. Infrastructure can be defined in a number of different ways. If we think about some of the publishing services that I spoke about towards the beginning of this section, some of that is in a lot of ways, it is infrastructure. But just last week, we learned that the Copyright Clearance Center, CCC, is acquiring Ringgold, the provider of metadata and a variety of services built around organizational identifiers. And this identifier landscape is a very, very important one. It's become an extremely important one. ORCIDs, DOIs, et cetera, this kind of like, I don't have a strong enough term to describe it as infrastructure, like in the work, in the inside of systems. That infrastructure is going to come increasingly under scrutiny as to, is it community infrastructure? How is it governed? Who owns it? Is it proprietary? How is it managed? With what interests? Is it competitive? How does that work? I think that services to watch here are those community infrastructure services, particularly not just, but particularly for identifiers, like ORCIDs and those that mint DOIs and things like that, where I think we're going to see more questions about whether those services are organized and governed in the right ways, or what the right ways for the future may look like. So I'm going to say just a word or two about patterns and just a brief reflection on assessment. And I certainly really welcome any questions, comments, discussion in a moment that anyone would like to offer. So just to kind of recap one thing, I hope I've convinced you that there are differentiated strategic directions that different companies and organizations are pursuing. These 7 are the ones that I went through. There probably are different ways to group them, and indeed, as new evidence comes in, I'll certainly continue to regroup and reorganize my thinking here. But at this point, this is a little bit of how I believe this space is shaping up. And the key point is that what Wiley is doing is not the same thing as what Elsevier is doing. What Springer Nature is doing is not the same thing as what Libris is doing. And that's okay. They compete with each other in certain spaces, and they collaborate with one another in others, which is a very, very interesting dynamic that has emerged in recent years that frankly is different than what the competitive landscape looked like 20 years ago. Now, I do want to talk about scale here. I've gone through several dozen acquisitions probably that we've seen over the last 5 or 7 years. The price that's paid is rarely disclosed. Sometimes there are rumors about it. In some cases, those rumors have looked like they could be at the level of $100 million or more to acquire one of these companies. These are big capital investments. And then having acquired one of these companies, while sometimes there's savings, there also can be additional expenses associated with integrating them, both technically and in other kinds of ways. And so the thing that I want to just make sure to say directly and unambiguously is that at least some of these strategic directions, they require a meaningful scale of capital in order for the companies to compete effectively in pursuing these strategic directions. And I'm not suggesting that any of these companies have done a fantastic job, by the way, of executing on some of these strategic directions. Some have done better than others, but just to be in the competition requires a meaningful scale of capital. And I think that's something that is important. Now, finally, I want to reflect on whether these acquisitions I framed it as, are they bad? But really trying to think about, are they good or bad? And here I do want to reference a piece. It was a little bit provocative. It turned out to be a little bit provocative. I don't know that we expected that. But a piece that Joe Esposito and I wrote a year or so ago last year, where we looked at some of the ways that consolidations, that acquisitions and mergers can sometimes provide benefits. And so in asking are acquisitions bad, first of all, market consolidation absolutely can yield price increases for customers. I mean, I just want to make sure that there's no ambiguity in what anyone hears me say there, and not just higher prices, but potentially lock-in both for users and for customers who, as more things get consolidated together, it gets harder to switch to an alternative. I think both of those factors can be really, really bad for customers and really, really bad, for users. And especially over the last couple of years, we've seen some real concerns emerge, and I think valid concerns, at least in some cases, with issues around data governance and privacy, around surveillance models, and things that make us wonder, like, is this really the right direction for some of the platforms and services that ultimately support research and teaching and learning? But on the other hand, there are also some ways in which some of these acquisitions may not only not be bad, but might actually be positive. In some cases, the companies being acquired are not so stable, not so sustainable in some cases on their own. They don't have the capital to reinvest in themselves. And so scale can yield stability and sustainability for them. In the case of workflows that sometimes have been far from seamless, where end users are faced with deep frustration working across multiple systems, integration and increased seamlessness can be really, really valuable for users. And there are cases where sometimes an acquisition can create a bigger competitor that can, although we might say the scale is bad for some reasons, actually can provide greater competition for the market leader. And so in the end, we could emerge with a more competitive market ultimately, rather than a less competitive one. That's not to say that every merger is a good one, every acquisition is a good one, not at all. But we have to look not only at the strategies taking place, but also about their effects within the marketplace as it exists and as it develops, in order to understand where are their benefits and where are their risks or negative consequences. So with that, I will say thank you. And I think Leah's going to jump in a second if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Roger. That was a fantastic presentation, wonderful analysis of the current landscape there. And we do invite questions. You can send questions through the Q&A button. You can send them in the attendee chat. And Roger, we even talked about this. If you want, we can turn it on so that folks can raise their hand in the chat and speak their question to us, if you would like to do that.
Yep. However people want to come at me.
Yeah, bring it on, right?
Exactly.
So the first question we have through our Q&A button, I'm curious if academic libraries and their campuses believe there's a sound argument to be made to invest resources into supporting and managing a community-based open source solution, while companies such as Elsevier, Clarivate, ProQuest, et cetera, are building solutions that make it easier to outsource a significant portion of what was once considered a library infrastructure. That was a long one. I'm not sure. Are you able to see that on the screen now? I tried to make it. Okay, good.
Yeah, so I'll just reformulate that question if I can. I think, and not to reformulate it, but just to kind of just to try to restate it. So I think the basic question is, can academic libraries and their universities make a sound argument for community-based open source, while some of these major companies have solutions or are building solutions that are basically outsourced? And I think that's actually an excellent question. It's I think we're seeing an argument for I think we're basically seeing two arguments play themselves out at the same time. We're seeing a stronger and stronger set of really sophisticated and capital intense services that some of the vendors are publishers and other kinds of vendors are providing. And to the extent that and the biggest advantage that they bring to all of this is scale. They bring scale of resources, and they bring scale of a solution that they can spread across hundreds, thousands of institutions, not just in a single country or geography, but ultimately in some cases globally. But the countervailing argument is that, you know, the reason why they do that is that they are able to bring to bear capital resources from you know, at a level that's only possible in the public markets, or, you know, in some cases very richly capitalized private companies, and with the, you know, demands on returns that you know, frankly, some of the libraries and in some cases universities sometimes find distasteful. And I think that squaring that circle is a tricky one. In theory, I think open source should be able to compete effectively here. But the trick is to find open source that can scale in the same ways that, and with the same degree of agility and competitiveness that the vendor solutions have been able to do. We are, I think, have seen a number of open source models that have not yet proved themselves able to achieve that scale, achieve that agility, achieve that kind of competitiveness in terms of their mindset. Some open source projects are, you know, with the best of intentions, are really more about developing communities and collaborating, and you know, in some cases, professional development opportunities for their for some of their, you know, engaged individuals, and that's to take nothing away from that. Like, those are great things. But when a hard-nosed decision gets made about you know, should we pay for all of those things, or should we pay for the platform that just works, you know, quote unquote, just works? Decision makers are often faced with that kind of question. And I think in those cases, we need to see open source governance and open source principles step up to recognize the competitiveness of the ecosystem that they're involved in. That's not to say that all of them haven't or won't be able to do that, but I think that's really the bridge that that's the sort of mountain that they have to climb here.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. So there's another one here from Barry asking, Roger, can you give any specific examples where an acquisition increased competition? Finding it hard to square this with the reality I've seen.
Yeah, hi Barry. Nice to hear from you. Nice to connect with you. See you virtually. So I can't give you an example where that has absolutely happened, but I can give you an example of where things look two different ways at the same time, and where, you know, we're not going to probably know until far later what the effects have been on the market, right? So I think a lot of people would agree that in some of these workflow categories, Elsevier has been building up a really powerful arsenal in workflow and analytics, in some of the tools. And, you know, you saw Elsevier was present in maybe not every single one of those strategies that I went through, but like quite a number of them. And, you know, they're an incredibly sophisticated, incredibly well-capitalized organization for whatever people may see them as otherwise. And so when we look at Clarivate acquiring ProQuest, right, we can look at that analytically in several different ways. And I don't mean to say there's one right way and one wrong way, right? You can legitimately look at Clarivate and say, oh my gosh, Alma has a commanding position in the library systems platform market. Alma has, I don't remember what the number is, something like 90% of, you know, ARL institutions are on Alma. Maybe it's not quite that, but, you know, something in that kind of range, 80, 90%. And we're afraid of what combining, you know, Alma and some of those other properties with Web of Science could yield, right? Like that's a totally legitimate analytical framework to bring in looking at Clarivate. In Clarivate's acquisition of ProQuest, in my view. But I think an equally valid way of looking at it is, thank God Clarivate is finally going to step up and be able to compete with Elsevier. Because thank God someone's going to finally be able to do that on the workflow and systems side. I'm not saying one of those is right and the other is wrong. It might be that they're both true at the same time, right? And so it's not to say like this is like, you know, all rah-rah or all, you know, horrible. It's like trying to get at which of those things is the more important, or which of those things is the more dominant, or how do we look at those various factors together is for me a key question there. And I know that's a, you know, for many colleagues, that's, you know, that's really not an obvious perspective. I think for many colleagues, scale always yields higher prices, and that may well be the case, but it may be that higher prices are the price we pay to have a market that in the longer run has two major players in it rather than just one. That's just a possibility, right? I'm not trying to advance that argument, just offer it as a possibility. But I hope that gives an example of how I see that kind of thinking playing itself out.
Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, I think we are coming to the top of the hour. We can maybe take one more question if you have time, Roger. But for those of you who do have to leave, I want to say thank you for being here. And please do join us again at 1 o'clock. We have our In the News session about the Ukraine conflict that starts at 1 o'clock. So you'll use the same link through your email where it says Access Live Event. Just click the Wednesday 1 p.m. session and join there the same way you did here. Roger, if you want to take one more question.
Sure, let's take one more. Yeah, okay. That sounds great.
Let's see here. There was a question in the attendee chat from Derek. Workflows may appear seamless. However, there doesn't ever seem to have enough time or capital to make those services fully realized. How can we as customers leverage our concerns for positive resolutions that provide a semblance of stability for our users?
I am so happy that we have room for this question, because I think this is a really, really important one. And I think I'm going to answer this a little bit from a library perspective, because I think that we as customers suggest to me that that's the right way to answer this. So in my experience, when push comes to shove, a lot of libraries end up negotiating around price and content. And not to say there aren't other factors at play, but those tend to be the ones that rise to the top of the sort of top of the top of the sheet. And I think that one of the issues that a publisher has to grapple with, a provider here has to grapple with, is let's say they acquire 3 workflow providers, and then they face the question: do we integrate these together? Or do we just sort of let them, I don't want to say let them sit, but kind of let them continue along as they've been separately, right? So there's probably a couple of different questions there. In order to do the integration, there's a huge amount of not just platform investment, software investment, but there's also a huge amount of data investment that has to get made, right? You have to, at the most simple level, you've got users have accounts on 3 different services, and those 3 have to somehow get merged together, right? And so now I'm not even necessarily talking about the expense of that investment, but just think about the critique of data governance and surveillance and privacy and all of that. A lot of customers are saying, libraries are saying, we don't want you to do that. Don't do surveillance. Don't mine the data. Don't do that, right? So it's not just that libraries are sometimes not encouraging it. Sometimes the voices, at least of some library leaders and advocates, is not just a concern for price, but it's actually a concern to not do that integration. And I think in some cases, customers may not even realize that they're making that argument when they advance concerns about privacy and surveillance and data governance. So I think that's one thing that's important to point out. I'm not saying those things don't matter. I think they do matter. I'm just saying that I think that that's a piece of the puzzle that customers have to be thinking about, libraries have to be thinking about. But more generally, I think there are real costs here, right? And I'm not trying to say who should pay those costs, whether it should be the library paying those costs, or whether it should be the owner of those services paying those costs. But I do think there's a balance there in thinking about, from the company's perspective, well, is it going to add value, not just on the user side, but is it going to add economic value if I make this investment? And so, not to say that anyone should feel bad for those companies and struggling with that, but I do think that's a piece of how a company's probably thinking about that. So, how should a library leverage its concerns for positive resolution? Well, I think it's really a matter of thinking about which of those things matter most of all. And, to the extent that workflow seamlessness matters most of all, which I would argue for users is a really important thing, right? If you can save an hour a week by making things simpler, like that's a huge benefit to the end user. But it's not the only consideration. So how do you prioritize those considerations when you go to your vendors, when you when you go to some of these companies? Do you say, well, I'm most concerned about privacy, or I'm most concerned about data governance, or I'm most concerned about price? Or are you saying, actually, my users are most concerned about, if they are, users are most concerned about workflow and seamlessness? And I can't advise anyone without knowing a lot more about, particular community, about how to think about those priorities. But I do think that sometimes those workflow seamlessness priorities don't actually end up at the top of the list. So for right or wrong. What a great place to end. That's a really good question, and something that I think should cause a lot of us on all the different sides of this to reflect further.
Yes, thank you so much, Roger, for organizing and presenting this session. Thank you to all of our attendees for being here. I do apologize, there were a couple of questions we didn't quite get to, but maybe I can share those with Roger by email, or he can follow up afterwards, maybe.
Thanks so much, Leah. It's really been a lot of fun to participate, and I can't wait for the second half and Anne and the whole gang that's coming.
Yes, very exciting. So on that note, please do join us. Thank you once again to our sponsors who are supporting the session, but come back here at 1 o'clock for our next session. I mentioned this before, but you're going to join from that virtual event page when you go to your email, the confirmation email, and you'll just click, this one has the Thursday 1 p.m. highlighted, but click Wednesday 1 p.m., click that blue launch button, and be back here for the next session. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you then. Take care, everybody. Bye.